What you're about to hear should not be in this video. In the winter of 1873, deep within the forgotten valleys of Appalachia, a community of desperate men gathered in the darkness of a frozen night and committed an act so terrible that every record of it was deliberately destroyed. They dragged a man from his cabin, bound his hands with rope, and marched him into the mountains where no witness could follow. He was never seen again. His name was erased from church registers. His property was divided among those who condemned him. His wife and children vanished within months, and no one in the valley ever spoke of what happened. For over a century, this story remained buried beneath layers of silence, shame, and deliberate forgetting. But fragments survived. Letters hidden in attics, confessions written on deathbeds, court documents from neighboring counties that referenced a crime no one would explain. What these fragments reveal is not just a single act of frontier brutality, but an entire system of secret justice that operated in these mountains for decades, deciding who lived and who disappeared based on accusations that were never proven and evidence that was never examined. The man they took that night may have been guilty of something terrible, or he may have been entirely innocent, destroyed by rumor, envy, and the paranoid fears of isolated people living beyond the reach of law. You will never know for certain, because the people who killed him made sure that the truth died with him. But what you will understand by the end of this story is how ordinary men become executioners, how communities become prisons, and how silence becomes the most powerful weapon of all. Stay until the very last moment, because the final revelation will change how you understand everything that came before. The year was 1873, and the place was a narrow valley in the central Appalachian Mountains, a region so isolated that news from the outside world arrived weeks late, if it arrived at all. The nearest town with a proper courthouse was 3 days away by horse, and in winter, when snow blocked the mountain passes, that distance stretched to infinity. The people who lived in this valley had carved their existence out of unforgiving terrain, clearing small patches of forest for farms that barely produced enough to survive. They raised hogs, grew corn, and hunted whatever the mountains offered. They built their cabins from the trees they felled, married their neighbors' daughters, buried their dead in unmarked graves on hillsides, and lived according to rules that had nothing to do with the laws written in distant capitals. In this world, justice was not a matter of courts and lawyers. Justice was whatever the community decided it was, and in the winter of 1873, the community decided that a man named Silas Hensley had to die. Silas Hensley was not a native of the valley. He had arrived 5 years earlier in 1868, appearing one autumn afternoon with a wagon, a tired horse, and a woman who was introduced as his wife. He was tall, quiet, and worked harder than most men in the valley. Within 2 years, he had cleared more land than families who had been there for generations. His crops grew better, his hogs were fatter, his cabin was tighter against the cold. The people of the valley watched his success with the kind of attention that lives on the border between admiration and resentment. They noticed that he rarely attended church services. They noticed that his wife spoke to no one and seemed afraid of her own shadow. They noticed that he paid for supplies with coins that looked newer and cleaner than anything that circulated in these mountains. And they began to talk. The talking started slowly, as it always does in small places. A comment here, a question there. Where did Silas Hensley come from? Why did he never speak of his past? Why did his wife flinch when he raised his voice? The questions had no answers, which meant that people invented their own. Some said he was a deserter from the war, a coward who had fled while better men fought and died. Others said he was a thief, a man who had stolen money somewhere far away and come to the mountains to hide. A few whispered darker things, things about the wife, about why she never bore children, about marks some claimed to have seen on her arms. None of these whispers had evidence behind them. None of them could be proven. But in a place where entertainment was scarce and winter nights were long, rumors became a kind of currency, traded and inflated until they took on the weight of truth. The man who transformed these rumors into something more dangerous was named Ezekiel Combs. Ezekiel was 63 years old in 1873, a patriarch whose family had been in the valley for 3 generations. He owned more land than anyone else, employed more hands, and spoke with an authority that came from age, wealth, and a willingness to use violence when he deemed it necessary. Ezekiel had fought in the war, though which side he fought for depended on who was asking. He had lost 2 sons to disease and 1 to a bullet, and the losses had hardened him into something cold and unforgiving. He believed in order, in hierarchy, in the idea that some men were meant to lead and others to follow. And he believed with absolute certainty that strangers brought nothing but trouble. Ezekiel had disliked Silas Hensley from the moment he arrived. He disliked the way Silas looked at him, without the deference that Ezekiel expected. He disliked the way Silas prospered, as if success in this valley was something that could be achieved through effort alone, without the blessing of those who had been there first. Most of all, he disliked not knowing who Silas really was, where he came from, what he had done before. In Ezekiel's mind, a man without a past was a man with something to hide, and a man with something to hide was dangerous. The incident that set everything in motion occurred in late November of 1873. A young woman named Clara Denton, 17 years old, the daughter of a family that farmed the eastern slope of the valley, disappeared. She had gone to gather herbs near the creek that ran along the base of the mountains, and she never returned. Her father and brothers searched for 3 days, calling her name until their voices gave out, but they found nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign of struggle. Clara Denton had simply vanished, as if the mountain itself had swallowed her whole. In a larger place, with proper authorities, the disappearance would have been investigated methodically. Witnesses would have been interviewed, alibis would have been checked, evidence would have been gathered and examined. But in this valley, in this year, there was no investigation. There was only fear, and fear demanded a target. Within hours of Clara's disappearance becoming known, people began to remember things. They remembered seeing Silas Hensley near the creek a few days before. They remembered him looking at Clara during the last church service, looking too long, too intently. They remembered every strange thing he had ever done, every unexplained absence, every moment when he had been somewhere other than where people expected him to be. The memories were unreliable, contradictory, impossible to verify. But they were enough. Ezekiel Combs called a meeting at his farmhouse on the 4th night after Clara vanished. 12 men attended, all heads of families, all men whose opinions carried weight. They sat in Ezekiel's front room, lit by a single fire, and they talked about what should be done. The discussion was not a debate. It was a confirmation of what everyone had already decided. Silas Hensley was responsible for Clara's disappearance. The only question was what to do about it. Some of the men suggested confronting Silas directly, demanding that he confess and reveal where he had taken the girl. Others wanted to ride to the county seat and bring back a sheriff, but Ezekiel dismissed both ideas. Confronting Silas would give him a chance to lie, to escape, to destroy whatever evidence might exist, and bringing in outside authorities was unthinkable. The valley had always handled its own problems. Inviting strangers to interfere would be an admission of weakness, a surrender of the independence that these men valued above almost everything else. No, Ezekiel said. They would handle this themselves. They would take Silas Hensley, they would make him confess, and then they would deliver the justice that his crime deserved. The plan was simple. A group of men would go to Silas's cabin in the middle of the night, when he was asleep and vulnerable. They would take him by force, bind him, and bring him to a place in the mountains where they could question him without interference. If he confessed, they would execute him immediately. If he refused to confess, they would use whatever methods were necessary to extract the truth, and then they would execute him. Either way, by the time the sun rose, Silas Hensley would be dead, and the valley would be safe again. None of the 12 men objected. None asked whether Silas might be innocent. None suggested waiting for more evidence. They had already decided, and their decision was final. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. If you are not, do it now, because this story contains truths that were meant to stay buried, and only those who truly want to understand the darkness of the past will have the courage to hear them all. The night they chose was December 14th, 1873. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a thin layer of snow covered the ground, bright enough under the half-moon to make lanterns unnecessary. 8 men gathered at Ezekiel's farmhouse just before midnight. They carried rifles, rope, and the cold determination of people who believed they were doing something righteous. Ezekiel led them, riding at the front of the column, his breath visible in the frozen air. Behind him came his 2 surviving nephews, both young men in their 20s, eager to prove their loyalty. Then came Thomas Denton, Clara's father, whose face had become a mask of grief and rage in the days since his daughter vanished. And finally came 4 other men, farmers and laborers whose names have been lost to history, but whose participation was documented in letters written decades later. They reached Silas Hensley's cabin just after 1 in the morning. The building was dark, the fire inside burned down to embers. Smoke still rose from the chimney, a thin column that dissolved into the night sky. The men dismounted quietly, spreading out to surround the cabin, cutting off any possibility of escape. Ezekiel approached the door and pounded on it with the butt of his rifle. The sound echoed across the valley like a gunshot. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a light appeared in the window, flickering and uncertain, the glow of a candle being lit. The door opened a crack, and Silas Hensley's face appeared, confused, still half asleep, trying to understand why armed men were standing outside his home in the middle of the night. He never had a chance to understand. The door was kicked inward, and hands grabbed him, dragging him out into the snow. His wife screamed from inside the cabin, a sound of pure terror that several of the men would remember for the rest of their lives. But no one went to her. No one explained. They bound Silas's hands behind his back, threw a rope around his neck, and forced him to walk ahead of them into the mountains. The place they brought him to was a clearing about 2 miles from the cabin, a flat space surrounded by ancient trees that blocked out even the moonlight. The men had prepared it earlier that day, building a rough platform from logs and clearing the snow from the center. This was where Silas Hensley would confess, and this was where he would die. They threw him to the ground and surrounded him, their rifles pointed at his chest. Ezekiel stood directly in front of him, looking down with an expression that combined disgust, triumph, and something that might have been doubt, quickly suppressed. He asked Silas a simple question: where was Clara Denton? Silas did not understand. He had heard about the girl's disappearance like everyone else in the valley, but he had nothing to do with it. He said this clearly, desperately, his voice cracking in the cold. He had been working his farm, he had witnesses. His wife could confirm where he was. He begged them to listen, to investigate, to give him a chance to prove his innocence. Ezekiel did not listen. He had not come to hear denials. He had come to hear a confession, and he was prepared to wait as long as necessary to get one. The first blow came from Thomas Denton, Clara's father, who struck Silas across the face with the back of his hand. It was not a hard blow, not intended to cause serious injury, but it was a signal. It told Silas that words would not save him. It told him that these men had already decided his fate. What followed was not an interrogation in any meaningful sense. It was a performance, a ritual designed to justify a conclusion that had already been reached. For hours they questioned Silas. They accused him of crimes he had not committed. They demanded details he could not provide. They interpreted his confusion as deception, his fear as guilt, his tears as proof that he was hiding something terrible. When he denied knowing anything about Clara, they hit him again. When he insisted he was innocent, they tightened the rope around his neck until he could barely breathe. When he begged them to stop, to think, to consider the possibility that they were wrong, they laughed. They had already decided. Nothing he said could change that. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Ezekiel finally lost patience. Silas had not confessed. Despite everything they had done, despite hours of pressure and pain, he continued to insist that he was innocent, that he had never touched Clara Denton, that he did not know where she was. To Ezekiel, this stubbornness was not evidence of innocence. It was evidence of defiance, of a refusal to submit to the authority of the community. And defiance, in Ezekiel's world, was a crime almost as serious as whatever Silas had supposedly done to Clara. The decision to proceed with the execution was made without discussion. Ezekiel simply nodded to his nephews, who took hold of the rope around Silas's neck and began to drag him toward a large oak tree at the edge of the clearing. The other men watched in silence. Some of them, perhaps, had doubts. Some of them, perhaps, wondered whether they were about to take the life of an innocent man. But none of them spoke. None of them intervened. They had come too far, done too much. To stop now would be to admit that everything they had done was wrong, and that was something none of them could face. Silas Hensley's last words were not a confession, they were a curse. He looked at each of the men who stood before him, one by one, and he told them that they would never escape what they were about to do. He told them that their children would know, that their grandchildren would know, that the truth would come out eventually, and when it did, their families would carry the shame forever. Then the rope tightened, and he said nothing more. They left his body hanging until midday, then cut it down and carried it deeper into the mountains. They buried him in a place that only they knew, a narrow ravine where spring floods would eventually wash away any trace of the grave. They swore an oath of silence, each man promising never to speak of what had happened, never to reveal where the body was hidden, never to admit to anyone outside their group that Silas Hensley had been executed without trial. Then they returned to their homes and began the work of forgetting. The valley accepted the official story without question. Silas Hensley had simply left, they were told. He had abandoned his farm, his wife, his debts, and fled in the night, as guilty men often do. His wife, who knew the truth, was too terrified to contradict this story. She remained in the cabin for 3 more weeks, then disappeared as well. Some said she went back to wherever she had come from. Others said she walked into the mountains and never came out. No one investigated. No one cared. Silas Hensley was gone, and that was all that mattered. But the disappearance of Clara Denton remained unexplained. She was never found, alive or dead. No evidence ever emerged to connect Silas Hensley to her vanishing. And as weeks turned into months, and months into years, some people in the valley began to wonder whether they had made a terrible mistake. Leave a comment right now. This kind of justice terrifies me. Let me know if the silence of these mountains disturbs you as much as it disturbs me. The doubt began with small things. A man who had been part of the group would wake in the middle of the night, sweating despite the cold, unable to shake the image of Silas Hensley's face in his final moments. Another would find himself unable to pass the abandoned cabin without feeling a weight in his chest, a pressure that had no physical cause. Thomas Denton, who had struck the first blow, became increasingly withdrawn, spending hours alone in the woods, talking to himself in a voice his family could not hear. His wife found him one morning sitting in the snow behind their barn, staring at his hands as if he did not recognize them. When she asked what was wrong, he said nothing. He never spoke of Clara again. The first public crack in the silence came in 1879, 6 years after Silas Hensley's execution. A traveling preacher passed through the valley, a man named Jeremiah Blackwood, who had dedicated his life to bringing the gospel to remote communities. He stayed for 2 weeks, preaching each night to whoever would listen, speaking of sin and redemption, of the judgment that awaited all men. His sermons were popular, drawing crowds from across the valley, but one sermon in particular had an effect that no one expected. Blackwood spoke of secret sins, of crimes hidden from the eyes of men but visible to the eyes of the Almighty. He spoke of communities that protected wrongdoers, of silences that accumulated into damnation, of the terrible weight that secrets placed on the souls of those who carried them. He did not know about Silas Hensley. He had no information about what had happened in 1873. But his words landed like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples through every person who had been involved. That night, one of the men who had been present at the execution, a farmer named William Sutter, went to Blackwood's tent and asked to speak with him privately. What he said was, never recorded in detail, but Blackwood's journal, discovered decades later in a church archive, contained a single entry about the conversation. A man confessed to me tonight a crime so terrible that I could not sleep afterward. He spoke of judgment without law, of punishment without proof, of a body buried in the mountains that has never been found. He begged me to tell him that there was still hope for his soul. I told him to confess publicly, to seek forgiveness from the community and from the law. He said this was impossible. The others would never allow it. They had sworn an oath, and breaking it would mean his own death. I prayed with him until dawn, but when I opened my eyes, he was gone. William Sutter left the valley the next day. He told his family he was going to the county seat on business, but he never returned. A letter arrived 3 months later, postmarked from Ohio, informing his wife that he had found work there and would not be coming back. He offered no explanation, no apology, no farewell. He simply erased himself from the valley as completely as Silas Hensley had been erased 6 years before. His departure created anxiety among the remaining members of the group. If Sutter had talked to the preacher, what had he said? What might he say to others now that he was beyond their reach? Ezekiel Combs called another meeting, smaller this time, including only those who had been directly involved. They discussed what to do about Sutter, whether to pursue him, whether to silence him permanently. But the distances were too great, the risks too high. They decided instead to strengthen their own commitment to silence, to remind each other of what they had sworn, to watch for any sign that their secret might be exposed. This paranoid vigilance lasted for years. Every stranger who entered the valley was regarded with suspicion. Every question about the past was deflected or ignored. The younger generation, those who had been children in 1873, grew up with a vague awareness that something terrible had happened, something the adults refused to discuss. They learned not to ask. They learned that certain names were never spoken, certain places never visited, certain questions never raised. The silence became so complete, so thoroughly maintained, that by the 1890s, most people in the valley could not have told you who Silas Hensley was, even if they had wanted to. But silence, no matter how carefully maintained, is never absolute. Documents survive, letters are hidden in drawers and forgotten, deathbed confessions are whispered to priests who record them in journals that outlast their authors. And in 1903, 30 years after Silas Hensley's execution, the first piece of evidence emerged that would eventually crack the valley's wall of secrecy. The evidence came from an unexpected source, a lawsuit. Ezekiel Combs had died in 1898, leaving behind a substantial estate and a complicated will that his descendants immediately began to contest. The legal battle dragged on for years, involving lawyers from the county seat who had no connection to the valley and no reason to respect its traditions of silence. During the discovery process, they uncovered a series of letters that Ezekiel had written to his brother in Virginia, letters that had been preserved in that brother's estate and that contained references to events that Ezekiel had never intended anyone outside the family to see. The letters did not describe Silas Hensley's execution directly. Ezekiel was too careful for that, but they contained hints, allusions, coded references that a careful reader could piece together. In one letter, dated January 1874, Ezekiel wrote, "The matter we discussed before your last visit has been resolved. The stranger will trouble us no more. The methods were harsh but necessary, and I trust you will understand why I cannot say more in writing. Know only that justice was served, even if no court was involved." In another letter from 1880, he mentioned the oath that binds us still, and the weight that each of us must carry to our graves. These letters were entered into the court record as part of the estate dispute. They became public documents, available to anyone who cared to examine them. And in 1905, a journalist from a newspaper in the state capital did exactly that. The journalist's name was Samuel Mercer. He was young, ambitious, and fascinated by stories of frontier justice. He had heard rumors about the Appalachian valleys, about communities that had operated outside the law for generations, and he was looking for a story that would make his reputation. The Combs letters gave him exactly what he needed: a starting point, a thread to pull, a mystery to unravel. Mercer traveled to the valley in the summer of 1905. He posed as a land surveyor, asking innocent questions about property boundaries and water rights. But his real interest was the past, and slowly, carefully, he began to piece together what had happened 32 years before. He found people who remembered Silas Hensley, though they would not speak his name aloud. He found the remains of his cabin, long since collapsed into a pile of rotting wood. He found the clearing in the mountains where the execution had taken place, identifiable by the massive oak tree that still stood at its edge, its lowest branch thick enough to support a man's weight. And he found, in the county records of the neighboring jurisdiction, a document that changed everything. The document was a missing person report, filed in March 1874 by a woman named Elizabeth Hensley. She described herself as the sister of a man named Silas Hensley, who had last been seen in December 1873 in a valley in the central Appalachian Mountains. She reported that his wife had arrived at her home in Pennsylvania in February 1874, terrified and incoherent, speaking of men who had taken her husband in the night, of screams she had heard from the mountains, of a community that had told her to leave and never return. Elizabeth Hensley had traveled to the county seat nearest to the valley and attempted to file a complaint, but the authorities there had refused to investigate. They told her that what happened in those valleys was not their concern, that the people there had their own ways of handling disputes, and that she should go home and forget her brother. The missing person report had sat in a file drawer for 31 years, untouched, unexamined, deliberately ignored. Samuel Mercer was the first person to read it since the day it was filed. And when he read it, he understood that he had found something larger than a single story. He had found evidence of a system, a pattern, a way of life that had operated in these mountains for generations, beyond the reach of law, beyond the sight of the outside world. Mercer spent 3 more months investigating. He tracked down William Sutter in Ohio, now an old man living in a small town outside of Cleveland. Sutter refused to speak to him at first, but Mercer was persistent. He showed Sutter the missing person report, the letters from Ezekiel Combs, the evidence he had gathered from the valley. He told Sutter that the truth was going to come out whether he cooperated or not, and that this was his chance to tell his side of the story before others told it for him. Sutter broke. He talked for 2 days straight, describing everything that had happened on the night of December 14th, 1873. He described the meeting at Ezekiel's farmhouse, the ride to Silas's cabin, the hours of questioning in the clearing, the execution at dawn. He described the burial in the ravine, the oath of silence, the decades of paranoid watchfulness. And he described the doubt that had haunted him every day since, the certainty that had grown with each passing year that they had killed an innocent man, because Clara Denton had been found. Not in 1873, not even in the years immediately following her disappearance, but in 1891, 18 years after she vanished. Her body had been discovered by hunters in a cave system on the opposite side of the mountain range, more than 30 miles from the valley. She had apparently fallen into the cave while exploring, broken her leg, and been unable to climb out. The forensic examination, such as it was in that era, concluded that she had survived for several days before exposure and dehydration claimed her. There was no evidence of foul play. No evidence that anyone else had been involved. Clara Denton had died alone, in the darkness, while the valley spent its rage on a man who had done nothing to her. This discovery had been reported in local newspapers at the time. It had reached the valley, eventually. Some of the men who had participated in Silas Hensley's execution had read about it, or heard about it from neighbors, but none of them had spoken up. None of them had admitted that they had made a terrible mistake. The silence held, even in the face of proof that it was built on a lie. Samuel Mercer published his findings in October 1905 in a series of articles that ran for 3 consecutive weeks. The reaction was immediate and intense. Readers were horrified by the story of Silas Hensley, by the image of a man dragged from his bed and executed for a crime he did not commit. They were equally horrified by the community that had protected his murderers for more than 3 decades, that had maintained its conspiracy of silence even after learning that they had killed an innocent man. Editorials demanded investigation. Politicians called for reform. The state legislature passed new laws requiring counties to investigate reports of missing persons, regardless of where they originated. But justice for Silas Hensley remained elusive. By 1905, most of the men who had participated in his execution were dead. Ezekiel Combs had died 7 years earlier. Thomas Denton had died in 1896, having never recovered from the guilt that consumed him after Clara's body was found. The 2 nephews who had tightened the rope around Silas's neck had both died young, one from a farming accident, one from disease. Of the 8 men who had ridden to Silas's cabin that night, only William Sutter was still alive, and his confession, while morally significant, came too late for criminal prosecution. The statute of limitations had long since expired. The courts could do nothing. The valley itself was changed, but not destroyed. Many of the younger residents, shocked by Mercer's revelations, left for cities where the past did not press so heavily on the present. Others stayed, defending their ancestors, insisting that the articles were exaggerated, that outsiders could not understand the conditions that had forced men to take justice into their own hands. The debate continued for years, fading gradually as the generation that remembered 1873 died off, and was replaced by people for whom Silas Hensley was only a name in old newspaper articles. But some things could not be undone. The location of Silas Hensley's grave was never revealed. William Sutter, despite his confession, refused to say where the body had been buried, claiming that he no longer remembered precisely. The ravine where they had placed him had been transformed by decades of floods and landslides. Any trace of the grave had long since been erased. Silas Hensley's body was never recovered. His remains lie somewhere in those mountains still, unmarked, unmourned, lost forever in the vast and indifferent wilderness that witnessed his death. The story of Silas Hensley is not unique. It is not even unusual in the long history of American frontier justice. Across the Appalachian Mountains, across the Western Territories, across every region where law enforcement was distant or absent, communities took justice into their own hands. Some of their decisions were defensible, protecting the innocent from genuine threats. Many were not. Many were driven by fear, by prejudice, by the desire to punish outsiders, by the need to find someone, anyone, to blame when tragedy struck. The men who killed Silas Hensley believed they were protecting their community. They believed they were doing what was necessary. They never questioned their assumptions, never examined their evidence, never considered the possibility that they might be wrong. And in their certainty, they destroyed a life that had done nothing to deserve destruction. If you watched until here, it is because you could handle the truth. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who truly follows these stories. Leave a like if this story made you reflect on how easily justice can become injustice when it operates in darkness. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that the past is never truly past, that the decisions made by our ancestors echo forward through generations, shaping the world we inherit in ways we rarely acknowledge. And subscribe to this channel because there are more stories like this one, stories that were buried, stories that were silenced, stories that deserve to be told. Silas Hensley was not a perfect man. No one is. He had his secrets, his flaws, his reasons for coming to a remote valley where no one knew his name. But he did not deserve to die for the crime of being a stranger. He did not deserve to be condemned without evidence, executed without trial, buried without ceremony. He did not deserve to have his name erased, his existence denied, his memory suppressed for more than a century. And he did not deserve to be forgotten. Remember his name, Silas Hensley. He lived, he worked, he loved, he died. And now, at last, you know what happened to him. The mountains kept his secret for 130 years, but secrets, even the deepest ones, eventually find their way into the light. This is the truth that Appalachia buried in 1873. This is the truth that has finally been unearthed. And this is the truth that you will carry with you, whether you want to or not, for the rest of your life. The wind still blows through those mountains. The trees still stand where they stood that December night. The valley still exists, changed beyond recognition, but not entirely transformed. And somewhere, in a ravine that no one can find, in a grave that no one remembers, the bones of Silas Hensley lie waiting for someone to come, waiting for someone to acknowledge what was done, waiting for the justice that he was denied in life. But no one is coming. No one will ever find him. The men who buried him made sure of that. They scattered his grave with stones, flooded it with spring water, covered it with decades of fallen leaves and accumulated silence. They erased him so completely that not even the mountains remember where he lies. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing truth of all. Not that he was killed without trial. Not that he was innocent, not that his murderers escaped punishment, but that he is still there, still waiting, still alone in the darkness, and that the world has moved on as if he never existed at all. Silas Hensley was 34 years old when he died. He had been married for 6 years. He had cleared 40 acres of land from virgin forest. He had built a cabin with his own hands, raised hogs that were the fattest in the valley, grown corn that stood taller than any his neighbors could produce. He had come to Appalachia looking for a new start, a chance to escape whatever past he had left behind, a place where he could build something that was entirely his own. Instead, he found a valley that did not trust strangers. He found a community that measured worth not by what a man accomplished, but by how long his family had been there. He found neighbors who watched his success with envy rather than admiration, who interpreted his silence as secrecy, who saw in his prosperity not the reward of hard work, but the proof of hidden wrongdoing. He found a patriarch who believed that order required control, that strangers disrupted the natural hierarchy, that anyone who would not submit to local authority was a threat that had to be eliminated. And when tragedy struck, when a young woman vanished and the community needed someone to blame, he found that all his work, all his accomplishments, all his years of peaceful coexistence meant nothing. He was still a stranger. He was still an outsider, and outsiders in that valley, in that time, were disposable. The logic of exclusion is always the same. It begins with suspicion, with the identification of someone who does not quite fit, who does not quite belong. It continues with rumor, with the accumulation of stories that may or may not be true, but that reinforce the sense that the outsider is different, dangerous, potentially hostile. It culminates in action, in the decision to remove the threat before it can cause harm, regardless of whether the threat is real or imagined. And it ends with silence, with the collective agreement to forget what was done, to deny that it ever happened, to protect the community from the consequences of its own choices. Silas Hensley was caught in this logic from the moment he arrived. Nothing he could have done would have prevented it. He could have attended church more regularly, spoken more freely about his past, made more effort to integrate with his neighbors. None of it would have mattered. The suspicion was not based on his behavior. It was based on his identity, on the simple fact that he came from somewhere else, that he did not share the history and the connections that defined belonging in the valley. He was always going to be an outsider, and outsiders were always going to be vulnerable when the community needed someone to blame. This is the pattern that Samuel Mercer uncovered in 1905, the pattern that his articles exposed to a horrified public. It was not just the story of one man wrongly executed. It was the story of a system, a way of life, a tradition of informal justice that had operated in the Appalachian Mountains for generations. The men who killed Silas Hensley were not aberrations. They were products of their environment, shaped by circumstances that made their actions seem not only acceptable, but necessary. They were fathers, husbands, farmers, churchgoers. They were respected members of their community, pillars of local society. And they were murderers, complicit in the death of an innocent man, protected by a wall of silence that held for more than 3 decades. Mercer's articles changed the public conversation about frontier justice. They contributed to reforms that strengthened law enforcement in remote areas, that required counties to cooperate across jurisdictional boundaries, that created mechanisms for investigating complaints that might otherwise have been ignored. But they could not change what had already happened. They could not bring Silas Hensley back to life. They could not restore the years that were stolen from him, the future that was denied to him, the chance to grow old, to see his crops harvested, to sit on his porch and watch the sun set over the mountains he had worked so hard to claim. All they could do was remember, and remembering in the end is the only justice that some victims ever receive. The valley where Silas Hensley lived and died still exists. It has changed, of course, transformed by roads and electricity and the slow, integration of remote communities into the larger American society. The cabin where he lived collapsed long ago, its logs rotted, its foundations reclaimed by the forest. The clearing where he was executed has grown over, indistinguishable now from the surrounding woods. The oak tree where they hanged him still stands, though no one alive today knows its significance. But the mountains remember. They remember everything that has happened within their embrace, every birth and death, every triumph and tragedy, every act of kindness and every act of cruelty. They hold their secrets close, buried in ravines and hidden in caves, preserved in the patient accumulation of stone and soil and time. They do not judge, they do not forget, they simply endure, witnesses to the endless procession of human folly that passes through their valleys and leaves its mark upon their slopes. Somewhere in those mountains, Silas Hensley lies waiting. His bones have long since dissolved, returned to the earth from which they came. His grave has been erased by floods and landslides, its location lost forever. But something of him remains, some trace, some echo, some residue of the life that was taken and the injustice that was done. It persists in the stories that were finally told, in the records that were finally examined, in the names that were finally spoken aloud after decades of enforced silence. He was here, he lived, he mattered. And now, at last, you know his story. This is what Appalachia, buried in 1873, this is the truth that has finally emerged from the silence of the mountains, and this is the burden that you now carry, the knowledge that cannot be unknown, the awareness that somewhere, in a forgotten corner of the American past, a man died for no reason at all, and the people who killed him walked free for the rest of their lives. Remember Silas Hensley. Remember what was done to him. Remember the valley that turned on a stranger, the community that chose fear over justice, the men who convinced themselves that murder was righteousness. Remember the silence that protected them, the years that passed without acknowledgement, the grave that was never found. And remember this. It happened before, and it could happen again. The logic of exclusion never disappears. It only waits, dormant, ready to activate whenever fear overwhelms reason, whenever communities decide that someone must pay for their pain, whenever the pressure to find a guilty party becomes stronger than the commitment to find the truth. Silas Hensley died because he was different. He died because he was successful in a place that resented success. He died because a girl vanished and someone had to be responsible. He died because the men who killed him were too certain of their own righteousness to consider the possibility that they were wrong. He deserved better. They all deserved better. All the Silas Hensleys of history, all the outsiders and strangers and misfits who were destroyed by communities that could not tolerate their presence. They deserved trials. They deserved evidence. They deserved the chance to defend themselves, to present their case, to be judged by something more reliable than fear and rumor and the prejudices of frightened men. But they did not get what they deserved, and so we remember them instead. We tell their stories. We refuse to let them be forgotten. We carry their names forward through time, ensuring that their deaths, if they cannot be avenged, will at least not be meaningless. Silas Hensley. Remember his name. He lived in Appalachia. He died in Appalachia, and his body was never found. This is the end of his story. But it is not the end of the story itself. The pattern continues. The logic persists. Somewhere right now, in some community you have never heard of, someone is being marked as an outsider. Someone is being blamed for something they did not do. Someone is being judged by standards that have nothing to do with evidence or truth. The mountains of Appalachia have no monopoly on injustice. They are simply one example, one case study, one illustration of what happens when communities abandon the rule of law and decide to handle things themselves. The men who killed Silas Hensley thought they were doing the right thing. They thought they were protecting their families, defending their valley, eliminating a threat. They were wrong, and their mistake cost a man his life, poisoned a community for generations, and created a legacy of silence and shame that persists to this day. Learn from them. Learn from what they did and from what they failed to do. Learn that certainty is not the same as truth, that suspicion is not the same as guilt, that the desire for justice can become indistinguishable from the desire for revenge. Learn that silence protects no one, that secrets eventually emerge, that the past is never truly past. And remember Silas Hensley. He deserves at least that much. After everything that was taken from him, he deserves to be remembered. The mountains still stand, the wind still blows, and somewhere, in a ravine that no one can find, the man who should never have died lies waiting for a justice that will never come.